Hi guys, welcome back to the Social Tune and a brand new episode of Record Roundup. Continuing the saga, we have 10 more albums on the docket today, and today, for those of you who don't know, is the 19th of November, which is my birthday. So yeah, this is going to be an episode where, of course, I'm going to tackle all of my favorite albums of the year. There's not going to be anything here I dislike, right? Ugh, let's just get into it.
I get suspicious. I like to take the knife and twist it. Yeah, my love is sacrilegious. I'm not scared to admit it. This violence is delicious.
We start off with an album that I have very little to say about. Look, Halestorm has always been an act that I have thought was fine, but I've never really fully got into. They have a fantastic frontwoman, and they usually have a formula that works pretty damn well. Unfortunately, on their last album, that formula really backfired because of Jay Joyce really misunderstanding what made the band so great to begin with, which again, was their frontwoman, and pretty much nothing else. I mean, say what you will about the rest of the band, but they're not exactly amazing players, and they don't exactly have a knack for incredible hooks or anything like that. But with that said, this new album, Vicious, was actually pretty decent. I'll be honest and say it's not something I would ever willingly return to, but it's perfectly serviceable and middle-of-the-road hard rock. If you're a fan of hard rock, you probably won't have a problem with this. You probably won't love it, but you won't hate it either. And yes, I know I'm sounding very dismissive right now, but I will say that I did casually enjoy listening to this, which is more than I can say for some of the hard rock albums that I heard in 2018. So yeah, I'm giving this a light 6 out of 10. It's definitely not an amazing album, but it's one that I don't really have any major problems with. Check it out if you're curious, you may find something you like. Ugh, and on the flip side to that, let's talk about the new album by Bullet for My Valentine. Look, I've never been a big fan of metalcore, and this group is the pinnacle of exactly why that is. It's whiny, it's loud, it's grating, it's annoying, but while most of metalcore can at least rely on some really decent production and guitar riffs, Bullet for My Valentine has never been all that talented, especially not in the songwriting department. And on this album, lyrically, you're going to get pretty much exactly what you expect from Bullet for My Valentine. However, this is still quite possibly their worst album to date, and that has everything to do with the production, which takes away any of the bite and grit the guitars had to make them glossy and messy and just horribly clean. Too many rock bands have been doing this recently, and while a great band like Poets of the Fall can pull it off without too much of a problem, when you're a band who already has a ton of problems like Bullet for My Valentine, this is the last thing you want to do. It takes away any sort of bite or grit that the band even had to begin with, and basically leaves them like an unclawed cat. Clearly uncomfortable and an overall unpleasant experience for everybody involved. In other words, it's one of the worst albums I've heard all year, period. And while I would normally rate a Bullet for My Valentine a light 4 and be done with it, this is bad enough that it's getting a solid 3 out of 10. Do not listen to this, not even the fans liked it. Now, some of you may remember that one of the bands that I've been very kind to over the past couple of years of reviewing is the band Algiers, who fuse gospel and punk music into an incredibly potent mix. And because of my love for that band, another one that a lot of people were recommending to me was this one, Zeal and Ardor, who here bring a very similar combination of rock and gospel. And while their last album didn't really come together for me, I wasn't a huge fan of it, this one actually does a lot more to interest me, specifically because of its lyrics. While the last album felt a little bit aimless and more like it was posing with not really much to back it up, this one decided to double down on the gospel and brought in a ton of religious iconography, with several of these songs basically being modern-day slave anthems. Heck, with songs like Gravedigger's Chants, Servants, and especially Row Row, they even managed to make it incredibly catchy and memorable. I wouldn't exactly call it timeless or music for everyone, but there's something here that anybody can universally appreciate. And true, that can mean it's a little bit repetitive, but it feels more like it's repeating a mantra rather than just filling up space to be lazy. Now with that said, I wouldn't fully endorse this album for a very specific reason. That being that it can occasionally take a break from its meatier side to focus on weird instrumental interludes. And I'm not going to say that those instrumental interludes are unwelcome, as they do provide a little bit of respite from the energy that permeates throughout the rest of this, but they do feel a little bit out of place, and they don't really fit the mood of this album. It occasionally just kind of feels like the album switches to a completely different sound, and it just doesn't work for me anywhere near as well. The most egregious example of all being Coagula. But with that said, I did enjoy this project. Again, if you're a fan of Algiers, you probably will enjoy this, although I'm not going to say anywhere near as much. Nothing can quite match what that band has created for themselves. Still though, this is getting a solid 7 out of 10 for me. Good listen, definitely check it out.
I'm wearing overalls, one shoulder off. Dwayne Wayne flip glasses, syrup for my cough. It's gonna be lit. I ain't wrote shit. My contribution to this game.
Oh, it is absolutely freezing, but I'm determined to talk about these albums, so here we go. So next one on the docket is an album by a duo, one of whom I've spoken about briefly, and the other one whom I've never spoken about before, Quelle and Jean Grae, on their collaboration album as a husband and wife, Everything's Fine. Now some of you may remember me talking about Quelle before, when I talked about his last album, and you may also remember that I wasn't really a big fan of it. I mean, I thought it was good, but I really didn't understand why everybody was getting so worked up about it. And the more I've revisited his discography, the more I get the impression that he's a rapper whom I should like way more than I actually do. He does share a lot of traits with a lot of rappers that I do like Open Mike Eagle, for example. But maybe it's just the fact that he doesn't have much modulation to his voice, but it can be very easy for me to kind of tune him into the background. I don't know, there's just kind of a lack of energy to his music that kind of pushes me away, I'm not gonna lie. But with that said, maybe collaborating with his wife, Jean Grae, who has been known to make some incredible hip-hop albums throughout the 2000s, may actually improve things for him. And I will say, I think that these two balance each other out very well. Opposite Jean Grae, Quelle brings a lot more energy and visceral bars, and Jean Grae's a little bit more relatable and focused, not so tempted to just go down rabbity rap rabbit holes. And the subject of their collaboration is actually pretty interesting as well, an album about how, well, everything's fine, and all of the subtext included in that title is absolutely meant on this album, as they basically explore the concept of why people say everything's fine when everything is clearly not fine. And not only did they explore it, but they actually kind of expand on it. It's kind of genius how they dissect the idea, but the fact that by the end of it they're actually willing to fight back against that, to encourage a system where we don't just accept everything and say everything's fine, but fight for what we actually want and believe, it's something kind of inspirational. I'm not gonna lie that it did strike a chord with me. Now I will say, I haven't been quite as won over by this album as some other people, namely because the production just doesn't do much for me. I know that it's varied, and it does have some lusher moments here or there. Anna Wise in particular is just a fantastic feature across this thing, but once again, it's a little low-key, it's a little dense. And while normally I would love an album that's dense and would really want to dig through it, for some reason it just didn't really hook me. Once again, much like Quelle himself, it's an album that I like and respect, but one I feel I should like a lot more. There just seems to be something missing here. But as is, it's a great album that I really hope that all of you do check out. It's a solid 8 out of 10, and while I may not be over the moon about it, I do want you all to check this out because you'll probably get a lot more out of it than I did. And speaking of albums of husband and wife duos, okay, unlike Quelle and Jean Grae, these two need no introduction. The Carters, having gone through a messy couple of years where they both released projects telling their own side, and both of them were absolutely fantastic, have both decided to collaborate and come together to end this chapter in their lives. And frankly, It's really underwhelming. I went into this hoping this would mimic the sounds of one of their albums, but instead, this thing defaults into trap nonsense. Which is really a shame, because unlike the more ratchet tracks like Formation off of Lemonade, none of these are remotely as good or as catchy, with the possible exception of Apeshit. Also, Summer was a pretty good song, but apart from that, I have no idea why these two decided to collaborate. I mean, they have chemistry, but what they don't have here is much interplay. You don't really see them play off of each other all that much, which is kind of what we wanted as a public. I mean, when you're a husband and wife duo and you want to make this album as a statement as a couple, it shouldn't sound like you both recorded your parts on different days. But more than any of that, what really rubbed me the wrong way on this was how none of the content is remotely gripping or interesting. It's just flexing about how awesome they are, which I could hear on any number of Beyonce or Jay-Z songs. But specifically on Lemonade and 444, they were at their most vulnerable and their most compelling. So you'd think that when they were trying to end off the trilogy as a couple, they would want to bring that onto the project to both be vulnerable in the public together, because the way they do it here, it just kind of feels like they're trying to overcompensate and show that they're still the most awesome couple in hip-hop and music in general, when in fact we've now seen behind the veil. We know that they're not as solid as everyone likes to pretend. So yeah, unfortunately, while not as big a disappointment as, say, Wiley's Godfather 2, this really didn't give me enough of what I want. And aside from a couple of songs, I really don't see any reason to listen to this. Solid 5 out of 10, moving on to the next one.
I'm on top of the world, need a break, then I'll take to the top of the world.
So most of you would know Kimbra from her collaboration on the biggest hit song of 2012, Somebody That I Used to Know, with Gautier. And yeah, that song is still great to this day. But unlike Gautier, who has seemed quite content with staying out of the spotlight, Kimbra has been building an audience over the past few years, even before Somebody That I Used to Know. She's a very interesting, kind of ethereal and quirky presence in indie pop, who unfortunately over her past couple of releases has just kind of lost her footing in my opinion. And I was kind of hoping that this would be the project where she would kind of get back on board the wagon. Unfortunately, it's not really as good as I wanted it to be. Don't get me wrong, it's a good album and there are definitely some great hooks here, but the writing isn't really all of that interesting, and outside of a couple of catchy songs here or there, there's just not much to really grasp here in my humble opinion. Not that the writing's bad, but it can feel a little bit too simple. And the production here, unfortunately, isn't really that interesting either. Maybe if you got someone like a Jack Antonoff to come in and do something similar to what he did on Lord's Melodrama last year, maybe this would have a lot more promise to it. But as is, it's just one of those albums that is good and I can appreciate, but I just don't have much to say about, unfortunately. It's a strong 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious, but there's better pop music that's come out this year. That's all I'm saying.
Been on, bitch, you been con. Bentley tints on, Fendi prints on. I mean, I been storm, X-Men been formed. He keep on dialing Nicki like the Prince song. I been on, bitch, you been con. Bentley tints on, Fendi prints on.
So, Nicki Minaj has had a tricky 2018. I mean, she's been declining for a while now, but this year all of her insecurities were made painfully clear when her seat as the queen of rap music was rightfully overtaken by a much more talented and dynamic performer in Cardi B. And look, I'm not gonna say that Nicki was never talented or that she never showcased some excellent skills on the mic. But if we're talking about her music nowadays, aside from 1 or 2 singles that she dropped in preparation for this album, it's been a very long time since I've been genuinely impressed by Nicki Minaj. So when she released this album and it underperformed and the critics absolutely thrashed it, none of it surprised me, and I went into this expecting something along the lines of Scorpion by Drake. But I will give Nicki Minaj some credit, this is not as bad as I expected it to be. In fact, there are 1 or 2 moments, like on Barbie Dreams and Chun-Li, where she actually showcases that she's still a really good rapper. She's very charismatic, she can construct her flows in a very interesting way, and her rhyme patterns are still very solid. Sure, she does rhyme words with themselves a few too many times, and there is no excusing a song like Rich Sex with Lil Wayne, but again, it's not as bad as I expected, certainly more interesting than Drake's Drek, which I will eventually be talking about, trust me. I mean, okay, if we're gonna compare her to Cardi B, Invasion of Privacy is definitely the better album. It has better hooks, more energy, and is just more fun to listen to. And I will say that the bitchy, catty insecurity and the cheap shots she takes without actually naming names on this album does make it a little bit hard for me to defend Nicki here. Not to mention the production is nowhere near as dynamic or as good. So in other words, I would say it's probably on par with the Pink Print. An album with some real highlights, some major lows, and a running theme of sex and how she's the best and nobody else can touch her that just kind of bores me at the end of the day. So I'm gonna say a very strong 5 out of 10 from me. If you want proof that Nicki can still rap and deliver as an MC, then you'll definitely get it on this project. Just go into it knowing that it's very inconsistent and you won't get that all the way through. Right then, it is time to talk about another album that I've discussed on this show before, once again from my mid-year list. It is gonna be Liberty by Lindi Ortega. So this is an album that kind of caught me off guard. I've been a fan of Lindi Ortega for a number of years now, but I will say that none of her albums have really blown me away in the same way they have many other country critics. I get that she's a fiery singer, a great songwriter, and does have a knack for some really sticky instrumentals. But personally, I've been waiting for that project that would really bring everything together and really sell me on her. And while for many critics, this album was kind of seen as a mixed bag, for me, it is finally when Lindi Ortega did pretty much everything I wanted her to do. You see, this album is kind of an ode to Western films as a whole, with its heavily Spanish-influenced spaghetti Western instrumentation all across the board. The fact that the stories that she tells of his album take place in the old lawless West, and the fact that it seems like there's something pretty dark and dangerous, possibly the devil himself, hunting her on this album. And the entire thing is basically a big metaphor for a really bad relationship that she had to get away from. And when she finally does get away from it, when she's finally in the clear, she eventually is able to settle down and find new love again. Which sounds like a pretty simple concept, but she sells it so theatrically and so interestingly that I really can't help but be engaged by it. On top of that, this album has some of the most beautiful instrumental pieces, as well as some of the best hooks that you will hear this year. And while many people have highlighted Lovers in Love as the easy highlight off of this album, personally, I'd honestly consider it one of the lesser tracks, as what really interested me were the darker cuts, like Darkness Be Gone or Afraid of the Dark, and especially the Comeback Kid, which is basically a revenge story from beyond the grave. Trust me, I will be talking more about that song in a future video, but for now, it stands as a perfect centerpiece as to why this album is so awesome and why all of you should definitely check it out. You won't get many country albums like this decade, and I really do think that Lindi Ortega deserves a ton of credit for it. So yeah, for me, easily a 9 out of 10, definitely one of the best of the year. So if you're in the mood for something slightly more interesting and off-kilter and darker in country music, then this is a quintessential listen. Check it out.
With that old need to be on my way, someday I'll ignore it, but it won't be today. I travel on.
And from there, we pivot to something a little bit more traditional in country. I've talked about Jason Eady before when I talked about the best albums of 2017, where he appeared with his self-titled album. Not to mention more than one of the songs off of it actually made my top 50 songs of the year. But really, if you go back throughout the years, Jason Eady has been on my radar since at least 2014, where he made the absolutely incredible Daylight and Dark, probably his best album to date. The title track of which is one of my personal favorite country songs of the decade. But with all that said, I have to admit I was a little bit worried going into I Travel On. Not only had it only been about a year since his last project, but on top of that, the buzz surrounding this was that Jason Eady was trying to put more of an emphasis on the instrumentals rather than the lyrics. Which I do get, as some people have criticized Jason Eady for being just a little bit too stagnant and boring, but as someone who always really appreciated his down-to-earth and mature songwriting, it struck me as a necessary step, but one that I wasn't necessarily looking forward to. And with all that said, I Travel On is definitely not the best that you could hear from Jason Eady, at least not in my opinion. But I will say that it does achieve what it set out to do, while not entirely compromising what makes Jason Eady so amazing to begin with. Because yeah, this still manages to be an excellent country album. One that does emphasize the instrumentals a bit more, as you will find more instrumental solos and more interesting flourishes, but once again, it's one where the lyrics kinda take a back seat. Now that doesn't mean you won't get interesting songs on here. You'll get the storytelling that chills you to the bone on songs like She Had to Run, as well as songs about appreciating his middle age on songs like Happy Man and I Travel On. But again, the songwriting, it isn't quite as detailed or quite as gripping in the same way. Still definitely great, but there's just less of an emphasis on the storytelling and fleshing out the story as a whole. With that said though, I will say it does strike a very good balance. I was afraid that the instrumentals would be all I could go back to on this album, but I will say the hooks on this album are better than they've ever been, and they have kept bringing me back time and time again. And again, I don't want to undersell that the songwriting is still excellent. So overall, yeah, I'd still say it's a great album. I mean, it's Jason Eady, there's not that much he can really do wrong. Which is why I'm giving this a very solid 8 out of 10. Yeah, I know it's kind of predictable, but the guy's a genius. What do you want from me? And while this might just be his most compromised album to date, the quality is definitely still there. So if you're a fan of him, don't waste any more time and check it out. For our final album of the day, let's talk about Love Yourself Tear by BTS. Now, I've been asked to talk about BTS a lot. In fact, I think most music critics on YouTube have been asked to talk about this band quite a bit, especially considering they've had a pretty huge 2018, with some massive records broken, the fact that they debuted in the top 10 more than once if I remember correctly, and that they're easily the K-pop group that seems to have the most crossover in the US. And I'll also say that I'm not entirely a stranger to K-pop. I went through my K-pop phase a few years ago and I wasn't into that many bands, more like into individual songs that I found on YouTube that I still return to occasionally to this day. But to be honest, it's been a long time since I've checked out a full K-pop album, so I wasn't too sure what to expect from this. And honestly, as someone who expected this to just be sugary K-pop goodness, I didn't exactly get what I expected. In fact, weirdly enough, I would say this album has more moments of genuine maturity than a lot of people would otherwise expect going into it. In other words, when I put this on, I was very surprised to hear so many forlorn songs and ballads here. The title Love Yourself is actually pretty accurate to this, as it does genuinely seem to be an album about encouraging you to love yourself, and it takes the subject seriously. It doesn't treat it as a joke. Which is honestly why, and some of you may kill me for this, the big single Fake Love feels really out of place here. I mean, it's loud, bombastic, and unfortunately not all that well produced. Which means when you put it next to some of the quieter, slower songs here, it can feel very jarring. Not to mention that it's one of those kiss-off anthems that feels more bitter than it does triumphant. Which I know is kind of the point, but again, I just wasn't a big fan of it. So yeah, BTS, they might actually be more interesting than I gave them credit for. This is not the kind of album that I would have expected to listen to going into it, especially not based off of the crazy fan base. I definitely expected something more in the vein of One Direction or 5 Seconds of Summer, but what I got was actually possibly a step above, at least in terms of maturity. But with that said, it does mean that this album can feel a little bit one note. I mean, apart from that slight deviation away from the formula on Fake Love, most of these songs feel a little bit too samey. Not that they sound the same, but the tone is very similar throughout a lot of them. And the one or two times the album does get more fun and upbeat, it just kind of feels a little bit out of place and forced, or occasionally the production just lets it down. So overall, I did like this more than I expected, but not really as much as some of you might be hoping for. Meaning, I'm giving it a very strong 6 out of 10, and I hope you guys all take the time to check this out, because it is actually good, but I'm not giving it a full endorsement just yet. It's guaranteed that I will be keeping an eye on BTS in the future, but not enough to quite call myself a fan of theirs just yet. Sorry. And with the grass being mowed, that is all of my time for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I will be reviewing 10 more albums very, very soon, but for now, I hope you enjoy my opinions in this video. Let me know your opinions on each of these albums in the comments down below, as well as any other albums you'd like me to check out before the end of the year. So in the meantime, once again, leave a like if you enjoyed, please subscribe so you don't miss a thing, and until the next time, I'm Finn, and this is the Social Tunes, signing off.